I'm super excited to be here because Aziz and I are going to be traveling around the country for the next month talking about the release of the book, Saving Aziz, and this is the first place that we get to do it, so I'm super excited to be here with you this morning. As you watch the video, you've seen a verse at the end, Isaiah 6:8, and that verse led us to call the effort that we were doing was Task Force 6:8. That calling comes from the verse, and most of us are familiar with this verse. And then I heard a voice from the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And then I said, "Here am I, send me." And that prompting to say, "Send me," I think was the burden that every person on our 12-man team had felt in their hearts when we first started. We just felt this burden that, man, the governments of the world are not going to do the right thing right now. The United States government left and abandoned our allies there, abandoned Americans there. Other governments of the world were not stepping up to do the right thing, and God burdened the hearts of people to do it. And that was the heart of everyone we had, and I know it was the heart of a lot of people. There's a lot of people in this church that supported us, people from this community that supported us, prayed for us, and trust me when I say we felt your prayers while we were there, and that inspired us to move forward and continue to doing the work that we were doing. But you don't have to go to Afghanistan to feel burdened to do something for God. I mean, we like I said, we felt that burden. We knew we had to go get Americans. We had to get our interpreters that served us for 20 years, innocent women, children, vulnerable Christians that would be there. We knew we had to do that, and that's a big thing. But the truth is, and as Pastor Josh said earlier today, there's things in our life and all of our lives that God burdens our hearts to do. So you don't have to go to Afghanistan to feel that calling. Everyone here at some time in their life had felt a stirring from God to do something profound for God or for others. Now, when we hear that voice from God urging us to take action, there's also another voice we hear. It's the voice of the enemy that makes us question ourselves and ask ourselves, are we unqualified to do this work that God's calling us to do? Are we inadequate? Maybe because of our past failures or our experiences or lack of experiences or our fears or insecurities. Anybody ever felt called by God to do something, felt stirred to do something, and you just chickened out, right? Yeah, well, me too. And I tell you, this time in Afghanistan, I faced a lot of insecurities and self-doubt to move forward in doing this operation. But when God burdens us to do something, we're called to do it anyway, regardless of our fears, and that's what we really want to talk about today. What we did in Afghanistan, and I'll say this completely humbly, it was incredible. I mean, for 12 people to get together and pull off a rescue of 17,000 people, that was in fact incredible. And I'm very proud of it, and I'll probably be proud of it for the rest of my life. But I have to say that I am not smart enough or capable enough to pull that off. I got a lot of credit this year. We got Glenn Beck gave us the Bonhoeffer Angel Award. We were just recently recognized by Congress for the work that we did. But I'm telling you, like, as much as Josh read my resume, I am not capable of doing what happened. I'm not smart enough. No one on our team was capable of pulling that off. This was a complete divine miracle. It's a modern day miracle. What I've been asked so many times is how do we pull this off? How do we do it? And the only explanation that I have is that we watch God orchestrate a divine miracle to rescue these people. We just got to be a part of it. And so today, I don't want to tell you a story about our achievements and our accomplishments and what we pulled off in Afghanistan. What I want to tell you about is actually our weaknesses, my inadequacies, and why someone like me should never have been able to be part of this, but how God used us anyway. In the Bible, in 2 Corinthians 11:30, it says, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. Right? If I'm going to boast, I'm going to boast of the things that show my weakness. Why is that? Because if we're able to do things on our own, then we get the credit. But the things of God are not meant to be done on our own. And in our weakness, when we boast about them, well, then God gets the credit. And that's where it belongs. And that was certainly the case with Afghanistan. I talked about feeling inadequate to do the work that we did in Afghanistan. Like Pastor Josh read, my resume kind of speaks to the fact that I probably am a good candidate for this, right? I was a Force Recon Marine. I was a part of JSOC Task Force. Did 8 deployments to Afghanistan. On paper, I have a lot of experience to do this kind of operation, although I hadn't done it full time for a while now. But there's also another side of my history, and some of you guys know my story. When I came home from the 8th and last deployment from Afghanistan back in 2007, I dealt with debilitating panic attacks to the point that where I literally believed I was going to die. I had major anxiety, depression. I dealt with all kind of physiological effects on my body. It led me to almost having a divorce in my family. I made an attempt to take my own life in a suicide attempt and becoming another suicide statistic in the veteran community. I had a pretty bad history, and now I'm looking at going back to the same environment that caused me those problems. I'm looking at going back to Afghanistan, a place where I buried friends, a place where I had my life in danger to the point to put me in these panic attacks. And what if I go back here and something triggers and sends me right back to where I began all those years ago? That's a very fair thing to assess in yourself, and a very scary thing. So now I'm facing all these fears about, man, God's burdened my heart to do this, but am I still qualified? Am I overstepping? Am I doing something because I'm emotionally compelled, or is God really calling me to do this? Those are fair questions. And then I had this moment where I realized over the last 12 years of doing ministry, God has created the opportunity for me to speak to over 450,000 active duty troops. And when I go speak to these troops, one of the things I talk to them about is resiliency, and particularly spiritual resiliency. That slide's still up, Hunter. You can click it over. There you go. All right. One of the things I talk to them specifically about is spiritual resiliency. And the military breaks down resiliency in these 4 pillars: mind, body, spirit, social. Right? So being mentally tough to be able to do your job, being physically tough to be able to do your job in the military, socially being connected with the right people, and then spiritually having a strong spiritual foundation to have what it takes to do the work that the military needs to do. And I've been talking about this for 4 years, and I tell them about a time where I went to Afghanistan the first time, did those 8 deployments, and I'm with socially, I'm with the best team, right? I'm in the top tier one special operations team with the best team. Mentally and physically, I believe in myself, I'm mentally tough, physically I'm in the best shape of my life, but I didn't have that spiritual pillar. And I talked to them about how not having that spiritual pillar, how it almost cost me everything and led me down that spiral that almost ended up me taking my own life. I talked to them about the lack of having that spiritual pillar, and how if they had those 4 pillars and they had that spiritual pillar, they're going to be able to withstand anything they face in the battlefields of combat or the battlefields of life and be able to get through it. And I believe that message. And I've been telling them that for 12 years. But then now I'm facing the opportunity to go back to Afghanistan, and I thought, man, I've been just speaking that for 12 years in theory. I never tried it myself, right? The last time I went there, I didn't have that spiritual pillar, but I really believe it. And now I have this opportunity to go back and not be in theory, but really see what it's like to have this spiritual pillar. And but the problem is now that those 4 pillars, if I really am honest about the inventory myself, my mind's not quite as sharp as it used to be. So socially, I was going to go with some good people, but not to support the entire United States military. And physically, man, I'm in pretty good shape still. But right before I was getting ready to go to Afghanistan, I was like, I'm a big preparer, so I'm like preparing. I'm on my computer, like working. And when I get like in this mindset and start preparing for something, I don't eat, I don't drink, so I hadn't hydrated. I'm not eating, and I'm like, I need to get away from this computer for a minute, get my mind off of Afghanistan, and go to the gym and do some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. If you guys. People know my background. I've been lifelong martial artist. I love going to the gym, and when I get stressed out, I go in there and choke people and try to break each other's arms and legs. Like, it makes me relaxed. So I'm like, I'm going to go to the gym and train. And so I go to the gym, and again, not hydrated, didn't take time to stretch out. I'm just going to get on there, and I just start going with this like 20-year-old guy that I've been training since he was a kid, really tough guy. And within like 1 minute of training, I got injured. I snapped my groin muscle off the pelvic bone, and I was. Oh yeah, I was rolling around on the ground like screaming like a little girl, and it's probably one of the most painful things I've ever felt. And so I'm like, man. So the next morning I go to the emergency room. Actually, I had someone help me out and get me an MRI, and they looked at it and they said, yeah, you snapped the groin muscle off the bone, and you're going to have to get emergency surgery. And I said, I can't because I'm leaving for Afghanistan tomorrow. And they said, no, you need emergency surgery. And I said, well, let me ask a few questions. First question I asked is, if I just so happen to have to run to or from something, like, will I be able to do that? Will I collapse? Like, am I going to be a liability? And they said, no, because it's totally detached. You can't make it any worse. And that was my next question. Like, can I make it any worse? And like, no, it's as bad as it can be. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to Afghanistan. I'll get it done later. And I still have not got the surgery done, and I won't now. But I didn't have those 3 pillars, right? The only thing I have now is this spiritual pillar. And that's what was really what gave me the confidence to be able to move forward. And I'll tell you that there was a lot of reasons that everybody was involved in Afghan evacs. But for me, the main reason that I wanted to go in these evacs, for me, like the reason I wanted to go to Afghanistan to help was actually a little bit selfish. I think a lot of people in this church know about Aziz. Aziz was my interpreter during those 8 deployments to Afghanistan. More importantly than being my interpreter, he was my teammate and he was my friend. And he had served to me all 8 years of deployments, and he was someone that I cared very deeply about. And he was still stuck in Afghanistan with his wife and his 6 kids. And the thought of him being there was not something that I could deal with. I wouldn't have to live with myself the rest of my life, having left him there as our government decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. And I already talked to some of the people in the church about my opinion on leaving Afghanistan, and I could spend all day up here talking about it. But for me, regardless of why we're leaving, I had to get my friend. I mean, this is the guy, Aziz, saved my life on multiple occasions, on 3 times specifically. Saved my life probably every day, like, don't eat that, don't talk to that person, don't walk there. If you talk right now, they're going to kill us. Like, he saved my life every day, and he's one of the bravest people I know, and has served our country bravely for over 15 years in the special operations community. Like, I cannot leave Aziz there, and so I want to go get my friend. That's why I engaged in this. And I started putting together his team of about 12 guys, and as we're putting this team together, some of the most incredible, by the way, special operations people that in our military that are out. The people that are in the military now couldn't go because our government wasn't allowing them to go. So the people that were out were the people I had to go to, and guys with extremely qualified backgrounds to do this. And as I'm putting this team together, one of our teammates said, "Hey, there's this group of orphans, these 3,500 orphans that are abandoned. Let's get them as well." And we kind of paused for a second and said, we had the most incredible team. We had the passion and will to do this. Let's get as many people as we can. Let's get as many Americans, our interpreters, their families, vulnerable women, vulnerable children. Let's get as many Christians that be persecuted. I mean, all these people that needed help and no one was going to help them. We have the ability to do this. Let's help as many people as we can. And God really, I believe at that moment, God burdened our heart and called us to do that. And we were obedient to do it. And beyond that decision is when I believe that we witnessed a miracle. Because in a period of 3 days, the most incredible thing happened. The first thing that happened was we got access to go into the airport to do these rescue operations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, who I was not a fan of, by the way, at that time, actually gave us permission as the only civilians allowed to go there to do civilian evacuations from the airport. Which, by the way, if you've been around the military, that's a complete miracle that was allowed to happen on its own. And then we knew we had to, as we move people out of Afghanistan, we had to be able to have a place to bring them to, because if you're bringing someone out of a country without a visa and bringing them in another country, that's human trafficking, and the only place that's allowed right now in the world is Laredo, Texas, by the way. So we had to have a plan to bring them to. I had to say that. I didn't plan that, by the way. It just kind of came out. But in the real world of rules, you have to have a reason to bring people. So we called the United Arab Emirates, the country there, and the royal family. We told them our plan, and as we tell them our plan, they said that they would not only help us, but they would give us access to the humanitarian center to bring people to. They would give us like doctors and food and everything that would be needed to bring families there, things that we never even thought about. In addition, they would give us 2 C-17 planes, which are giant military planes, to move people out. Pilots, operations center, so they rolled out the red carpet for us. And then Glenn Beck up in Mercury One, lives up in Dallas, if you guys know who Glenn Beck is, the only thing he had to contribute was his microphone and getting behind that microphone. And he just got behind the microphone and asked for help. And he thought he'd raise a couple of $1,000s. Well, he raised overall $46 million, but in a few days he raised $21 million. And so he calls me and he's like, "Hey, Chad, we raised all this money and we don't know what to do with it." And I'm like, "I got just the plan. I know exactly what to do with it. You're going to start buying airplanes or paying for flights on airplanes." And in a period of 3 days, these things happened that I have no ability to pull off. It was an absolute miracle that God orchestrated all these things, and we moved forward. And when I say God orchestrated all these things, it's amazing to watch God work and use people from all different, people that aren't from the same faith and everything like that. We had this Jewish organization call us up and they said we want to chip in and pay for 2 flights. One was $800,000, one was $700,000, so $1.5 million in flights. And they're this Jewish organization out of Israel. And so we give them the information, and they're making the wire transfer to Mighty Oaks Foundation, and they call back and they say, we can't make the donation. And I'm like, oh, they give you your routing number wrong? Like, what happened? And they say, no, you're a Christian organization, and we're a Jewish organization. We can't give money to a Christian organization. And I was like, okay, but you do realize we're rescuing Muslims, right? And they all kind of both laughed, and they moved forward to make the donation. And it was just such this beautiful thing to see God like orchestrate all their people that came together just to do the right thing for their fellow human. And it was a really beautiful thing to be part of. And as we moved into Afghanistan, we got to the airport. We got to the airport in Abu Dhabi, and we set up operations center there. And we put a ground team on the ground in Kabul that was going outside the wire. And man, everything happened so fast. The first day, we got Aziz, his wife, and the 6 kids, his family, and who are here with us today. By the way, if you don't know, they're here in the front row. Yeah, you guys can stand up. Then we moved on. After that day we got 180 people, and the next day we got 800, and the next day we got 1,000, and everything just happened so fast. It was really just a blur. We didn't know how much time we had, but we knew that every time we stopped, even if you stopped for 5 minutes of sleep, you felt guilty because you're like, I'm trading that 5 minutes of sleep for somebody's life. And so we just didn't stop. I mean, my friend C-Spray, one of the guys in the video, his face was blurred out. He lost 37 pounds in 10 days because he just did not stop moving and just not stop trying to just get people out. And during that time, by the way, if you're like wondering, all the people that we got out, we were vetting, and these are people that are vetted, and they were going to the State Department in Abu Dhabi to get vetted. So we were not just bringing random people out. We were not just grabbing people. We had a strategic team that was taking requests, vetting them. We had to know who they were. We had a bona fides process to link up with them, something that we did very well and very efficiently because of the experience that we had in our team. Unfortunately, the United States military, and this is not a hit on the military, it's a hit on people in higher level government, that they were just bringing mass amounts of people that we didn't even know who they were. We were very thorough in our process to get people out. And as we're getting people out, we did that for about 10 days, and it ended when that Abbey Gate was blown up. And if you guys remember on the news, we lost 13 of our service members that day. And the military had to weld the gate shut, and the evacuation operation was over. We had no idea at that time how many people we had got out. Later learned that at that time, we got 12,000 people out at that time. And the military had to leave when the wheels left the ground for that last military plane in Afghanistan. That was the end of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan for 20 years, and the country has been in chaos since then. We were not part of the military, so we did not have to leave, and we chose to stay. From my background and my experience, I knew that it was not within me or within any of our teammates to leave American citizens behind. The news was reporting what the White House said was there were 100 Americans left there. I knew personally, this isn't a debate between me and the White House. I'm telling you personal firsthand testimony that there were thousands of Americans still there at the time. And I could not leave knowing that. We cannot leave knowing that. In fact, for me, however, it doesn't matter if it's 100 Americans or 1,000 Americans. If there's one American that's left anywhere in harm's way, that is a promise you have by the government. We do not leave Americans behind. Even some idiot like Joe Berdahl, who's a traitor, like we went after, and we knew we were giving up people's lives to go get him. Like where I come from in the military, like we'll scorch the earth around that person to go rescue them. That's the mentality of the military, especially in the special operations community, to go rescue Americans behind enemy lines. We couldn't leave, and so we chose to stay. And over a period of about 2 more months, we were able, and I say we, a large group of nonprofits that came together in a coalition that we led, were able to rescue 5,000 more people, totaling 17,000 people. Thank you. Super proud to say one of the people of that 12-man team that we had was my son Hunter, who's a Marine, Afghanistan veteran as well. He's the one messing up the clicker. And when that time in Mazar Sharif, that area we were flying people out, dried up and ended, we didn't have any more way to fly people out anymore. We made a decision to continue on. And we were looking at different ways. There was a lot of different options we were looking at to keep helping. But what happened is all the people all the Afghans had moved to a place called the Panjshir Valley. And in the Panjshir Valley was the last resistance. Ahmad Massoud's son. Ahmad Massoud was like the kind of leader of the fight against Osama bin Laden. He was the leader of Northern Alliance. And his son had taken over the resistance and was kind of following his father's footsteps. So everyone went to the Panjshir Valley, and they were trying to cross this river called the Panjshir River into the country of Tajikistan. And so as we learned that they were doing that, we looked at it and we said, man, these people are going to die trying to cross because the terrain there is crazy. Like I've operated in that terrain there, 25,000-foot mountain peaks. And then on top of the 25,000-foot mountain peaks, the Panjshir River is like a lot of places. If you go through a valley to get there, you may end up with a 1,000-foot cliff over that river. And so you traveled a week long for nothing with a family, and you're probably going to die from the elements. And then in addition, if you made it in the river in some areas are Category 5 rapids and ice melt water. I mean, it's like if it stops moving, it freezes. It's like a slushy. So that's like this river they're going to cross. On top of that, the Taliban have checkpoints all through there. The Chinese military moved there to protect the border. The Russian military was there. And the Tajikistan border guards were there. So it's like an impossible way to cross. And so we said, man, they can't pass without information. We have to be able to provide information to them on where to pass. And as a Force Recon Marine, that's one of our jobs, doing route reconnaissance and fording reconnaissance to be able to identify crossing points in different areas like this. And so we started looking at how we were going to do this operation. So we decided to put a two-man team together to do reconnaissance at that border and provide the right information to our government agencies, people in our government agencies that still wanted that information, non-government agencies, nonprofits that were helping, and the Afghan people that were stuck there. We want to provide the right information so they could safely cross. And so we started looking at a team that we were going to put together. I ended up reaching out to the Marine Corps and asking for the permission of a active duty or reservist Marine, just switched from active duty to reserves, named Staff Sergeant Dennis Price. Staff Sergeant Price had a lot of experience in this kind of job as a Force Recon Marine. He was also a scout sniper and had some specific skill sets that I wanted, and I had met him before, trusted him, believed he was the right guy, and put in a request, and the Marine Corps actually granted him permission to come on this humanitarian mission with me, and Dennis Price is here with us today as well. And so So Dennis Price and myself, we took off on a flight, and that's a pretty long flight when you're going on the other side of the world, and we're flying to Tajikistan. And as we're flying, I actually had a moment to kind of pause for the first time in a month and think about what was actually happening. The Afghan evacs at the airport were not so risky for me personally. For some of our other teammates it was, but for me personally it wasn't. But going into this, I knew what I was going into. We're going to fly into Tajikistan by ourselves, just two of us, with no weapons. We're going to go unarmed, and we're going to swim into Afghanistan. That's what we're about to do. And there is going to be Chinese military, Russians, the Taliban, and I started thinking, man, this is actually pretty crazy. And kind of the first time it kind of hit me. The first time I kind of thought that this is actually pretty crazy. And I thought, what if I go there and I face some of these things that trigger some of these things I dealt with before, right? I made an emergency run before after I've gotten well with my blood pressure 200/130, stroke level, right? I've dealt with panic attacks in the past years. I mean, I've struggled before, so now I'm sitting on this plane thinking, what if I go there and some of this hits me, and now I'm a liability to Dennis, who has a wife and 4 little kids at home. What if I'm dealing with this out in the middle of those mountains? And when fear creeps in, it could be, it could really get a hold of you. And I know that, and I thought about that message that I give to all these young military soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen through the years. And I thought about that spiritual pillar, and I did exactly what I've been telling them to do. And I went right to God with this burden, and I said, God, you burdened my heart to be here, and you've opened doors to make it possible. As much as I wanted to do that, it's almost impossible for that to happen. So God opened all these doors. So you burdened my heart to be here. You made this possible. If you want me to go help these people, then I need you to take away any anxiety, any stress, any fear, to be able to do this and do my job. And I prayed that prayer, and I literally in that moment felt a peace that the Apostle Paul describes as a peace that's beyond understanding. I felt this peace. We landed in Dubai for our layover, and Dennis is a Christian as well. I told him about that. We prayed together, and when we prayed together, we both felt this peace as well. We got on that plane, and we flew into Tajikistan. drove about 12 hours through the mountains. A lot happened in between. We drove about 12 hours through the mountains, and we spent the next 10 days doing a border reconnaissance. We did 90 miles of border reconnaissance. At nighttime, we'd swim across that river to gather that information. And, it was a very crazy environment, like I said, but I can tell you, and I say this humbly, like at no time, and Dennis will attest, like no time I ever felt fear. I never felt nervous, scared. We felt a very clear mind to do exactly what we were there to do. We slept maybe, an hour, 2 hours like per day at the time. I never felt tired, probably because the cold water kept us awake. We were very focused, and we got a lot done. And man, the environment there, some of these routes, like this one route that we identified for crossing, like 100 meters away on this side is a Taliban with like 3 Taliban soldiers on the roof, and 300 meters this way is a BMP, which is a Chinese mechanized vehicle with 3 Chinese soldiers on it, a PKM, which is a giant heavy machine gun, and a giant spotlight for people crossing the river. Like that's the environment we were in, and it was one time we were crossing the river, and we were like swimming across this river with my busted groin, and the water's ice cold, and we had an Afghan taking us in this part of the river, and this Afghan man points out to this motorcycle passing by with 2 guys on it. He said, "That's the Taliban scouts," and we were like 30 yards away, and I remember like thinking like, God, what the heck do you have me doing in this river? Like I busted groin, this water's freezing, and what do you have me doing here? And I couldn't answer that question at the time. While I believe we were extremely successful to get the information to help a lot of people, and like I said, I couldn't answer that question at that moment. But 4 days later, only 4 days later, I'm in San Diego, California. And I'm standing in front of 3,000 Marine Corps recruits at Marine Corps boot camp, and I'm giving that message again on the 4 pillars of resiliency. And I'm able to tell them now how there was a time in my life where I had 3 of those pillars, but it didn't have the spiritual one, how it almost cost me everything. And now, just 4 days ago, I was in this river, and man, again, my mind wasn't where it used to be. My body certainly wasn't. My team socially, I had Dennis, but he's just one guy, right? I love him, but he's just one guy. But that spiritual pillar was the one that I needed, all I needed to be able to do what I needed to do. I believe there's a lot of reasons that God allowed me to be part of that mission, but I believe that was one of them, to be able to give that testimony to all the warriors that God gives me the privilege to be in front of. Look, there are times in our life that we believe that God's leading us to do something, but because of our past experiences, because of our insecurities, we feel unqualified. It doesn't have to be something like Afghanistan. It could be parenting. Parenting's scary. You think like, man, I can't even trust myself, and now God's given me the responsibility of another human being. Like, how scary is parenting? Or in the relationships, like, you're like, I can't be the dad or mother I need to be. I can't be the husband and wife I need to be because of my own hang-ups. It could be like a job or a hobby or different goals you have in life. There's so many things that we want to do that we feel called to do, but we disqualify ourselves. Maybe even service in your community or this church. As amazing as this church is, and there's so many. We had like 50 people up here doing the worship service in the beginning. There's so many opportunities to serve in churches and communities like this, but we oftentimes like disqualify ourselves. We say like, man, if people really knew me, if people knew my past, if people knew what was in my mind and my heart, they would never want me to be able to be part of this. And we disqualify ourselves, and it keeps us from exactly what God called us and created us to do. Lack of obedience to God's calling, or in general not taking action, is typically based on fear. I actually just did a message last month on fear over at Woods Edge, and in that message I brought up a point that I think is pretty astounding, that in the Bible, the words "do not fear" in some form or another shows up 365 times. That's one for every day of the year, right? That fear that we face typically comes out of putting our trust in the wrong places, mainly ourselves. And when we attempt to trust ourselves and lean on ourselves, that fear or doubt will immediately set in, because we know ourselves, right? We know we know our strengths. If we're honest, we know our weaknesses. We know what we can and can't do on our own. But God knows it even more, right? He knows our strengths. He knows our weaknesses. He knows what we're capable of. The Bible says in Luke 12:7 that He knows the numbers of hairs on our head, which means a lot to me these days because the numbers of hairs on my head keep changing like every minute. So it means He's constantly with me, right? God knows us, and He knows what we can and cannot do on our own. But He calls us anyway, right? He calls us anyway, despite our insecurities, despite our inadequacies. And that's why we got to do 3 things, and I got 3 points here that I think are important when we talk about trusting God. Number one is we have to have faith in God. One, we have to have faith in God. In 2 Corinthians 5:7, it says, "For we walk by faith and not by sight," right? We walk by faith and not by sight. If we look at things that we get called to do, usually the things that God calls us to do, if we look at them, they often seem impossible, and we'll chicken out. Because, if you look at something like Afghanistan, and I thought of Afghanistan and said, man, okay, here's the plan. I'm going to take 12 of my friends. We're going to go into Afghanistan. We're going to get 17,000 people. Anybody got any money? No, I'm like, I don't have any money. Anybody when's the last time you did this? Like 14 years ago. Like, we looked at it, we'd be like, no way, we can't do that. We can't take 12 of us and go into Afghanistan and pull this off. It would seem impossible. When you look at things through faith and not by our own sight, that's when we can trust God to do God-sized things. We couldn't do that, but God can. God can do that. Number two, we need to be obedient when he calls us. In 1 Thessalonians 5:24, it says, "He who calls you is faithful, and he will surely do it." Right? He who calls you is faithful, and he will surely do it. If you believe in your heart that God is calling you to do something, then don't analyze it. You need to say yes. If you believe that God's really calling you to do something, you don't analyze it, break it down, figure out, come up with a plan. Like, you got to say yes first, and then come up with a plan. You make the decision, you're going to be obedient. In ministry, we have a saying, if it's God's will, it's God's bill, right? He's going to figure it out. If he's calling you to do it, he's going to figure it out. And we're going to be able to trust that, not lean on ourselves. Number three, don't compare. Galatians 6:4 says this, "Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else." Theodore Roosevelt has an amazing quote. He says, "Comparison is the thief of joy." Comparison is the thief of joy. If we compare ourselves to others, if we compare what we are part of to other people, not only do we steal the joy from ourselves and we steal the joy from the other person, but we actually also rob God of his glory, right? We can't compare ourselves to other things. The thing that we do doesn't matter. Afghanistan was a big thing, right? It was a big thing. But the size of the thing doesn't matter. What matters is what God is calling you to do, and you being obedient to what God is calling you to do. That's what matters. Trust me, I'd be much more scared of going work in the children's ministry than going back to Afghanistan. I could do Afghanistan. I could do it again if we have to go. But the children's ministry, that's something else altogether. And there's a lot of things that God didn't call me to do, and there's a lot of things I'm not good at. And if you don't believe me, just ask my wife. She's up here in the front row. She'll give you a whole list of all the things I'm not good at. Right? God doesn't care about the worldly accolades or measures of successes that we do. We all get caught up into this. I'm a competitor by nature. It's who I am. So trust me, I do, even in ministry. Like, it's the first year right now. I already have all my metrics is set out. I know the goals we have for the year at Mighty Oaks Foundation. I know how much money we want to raise, like what our goals are there. I know how many veterans we want to bring through our program, how many first responders we want to bring through, how many we want to get baptized. I already know the percentage that we're aiming for. It's more than last year. I'm always trying to up it. And then how many bases I want to go to speak to the troops. I have all that laid out. And when we hit those milestones, I'm the first to be high-fiving. And when we don't make the milestones, I'm like kicking the ground upset and telling and figuring out how we can do it better next year. But, and by the way, it is good to have milestones. It's good to be driven. It's good to be disciplined and organized. But God doesn't care about all those things. What God cares about is us being obedient to him when he calls us to do something. That's what God cares about. And then he cares about us trusting him in the process. And then he cares about us giving him glory when the victory comes. That's what God cares about. Now, as it turns out, the Bible is full of characters just like me and you who struggle with really getting this. In fact, most of the heroes of the faith were men and women that faced moments where they were either scared or felt unqualified to do exactly what God was calling them to do. But at some point, you see them simply make a decision to say yes and be obedient. And one of those people was a man named Gideon, who I personally really relate to. I love the story of Gideon. After the Israelites entered the promised land, the Midianites heavily oppressed them, and they actually killed them. They would pillage their homes, destroy their crops, and they'd kill all their livestock. And some people began to hide, some people went into hiding. They started living in caves. And a lot of people even turned away from God because they believed God had forsaken them to the Midianites. By the way, it's the Midianites, not the Mennonites. The Mennonites are super cool people. I used to live next to them in Colorado. They dress kind of funny, but they're always real good people. The Midianites are actually the bad guys, and they oppress God's people. And in times of history, when we see such oppression, God always raises up warriors to stand in the gap and fight his battles. But it's not always the model warrior we'd expect. Look at King David. The mighty King David didn't slay Goliath. It was the little shepherd boy, David, that slayed Goliath. If you watch that video, remember back the video we showed at the beginning? There was a lot of gray hair in that video. Hosanna 6 there was, Dano, he was pushing about 60. Most of us were in our 40s. I got the busted groin. We were not exactly the A-team, but that's who God wanted, right? In this case, Gideon, God's calling Gideon to overtake the Midianite army, and the odds were totally stacked against Gideon. He was the weakest member of his family, the Bible says, from the weakest tribe in Israel, and he was scared. How do we know he was scared? Because when the Bible introduces him, he's hiding in a cave down in a wine press, beating out wheat. I never beat out wheat before, but I read about it to tell this message, and I guess when you beat out wheat, you want to be up in the wind, so the wind separates the wheat from the chaff, right? So he's actually down in a cave, hiding, beating out wheat when the angel of the Lord comes to him. And if we go to Judges 6, verses 12 through 16, it says, the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, and he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And Gideon's reply is, pardon me, my Lord? But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did the Lord not bring you out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hands. Am I not sending you? Pardon me, my Lord, Gideon replied. But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and I will strike down the Midianites, leaving none alive. Gideon literally argued with God, like, who, me? Like, you're at the wrong address. I'm not your guy. Like, I'm not strong enough. And God said, am I not sending you? Right? Am I not sending you? God was using the unexpected to do the unimaginable. In my life, in your life, God will use us, the unexpected, to do the unimaginable. Gideon chose to say yes, and he was obedient to that calling, regardless of his insecurities, regardless if he was qualified or not. Gideon chose to say yes. And so he did what most of us would do. He got as many of his friends he could. He actually got 32,000 friends, right? 32,000 now. Apparently he has more friends than me because I was only able to get 12 for Afghanistan. But while 32,000 sounds like a lot, he had to face the 135,000-man Midianite army. 135. That was a 4-to-1 odds. Those are 4-to-1 odds. And you know what God told Gideon? You have too many people, right? He raises up this army, and he tells him, you got 4-to-1 odds, and you tell him you had too many people. Why did God do that? Because God didn't want Gideon to get the victory. Even at 32,000, right? He could have. That's a formidable force. 4-to-1 odds is a lot, but maybe he had a good strategy. Maybe he got lucky, and then Gideon would have got the credit. God didn't want Gideon to get the credit. God wanted everyone to know that what happens when you stand against God's people. He wanted people to know that God intervened there. In Afghanistan, there's a lot of people that could have did that job better than us, if we're being honest. The United States military could have stood up and rescued those 17,000 people and probably did a better job than we did. And they would have if they would have been allowed to. But you know who would have got the credit? The United States military. God picked the 12 of us veterans, old-timers, because he wanted the credit. And he gets the credit for me for that. God told Gideon to send home any fighters that was scared. Apparently a lot of them were scared because 22,000 of them left. And Gideon's friends, right, only 10,000 that remained, right, his so-called friends. Now they're outnumbered 14-to-1, which is crazy, right? Those crazy battle odds, 14-to-1. But you know what God said? You still have too many, right? I imagine Gideon had to be like so frustrated, like, God, what in the world? You asked me to do this impossible mission. I already told you I'm like the least qualified to do it. And I raised up this army of 32,000 people, and you totally dismantle it. Like we're down to 10,000 now, and I still have too many people. God sent Gideon down to the river to select his final men, and he said this, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as dogs lap from those who kneel down to drink, right? So 300 men went down to the river, scooped up water, and lapped with their tongues, And the 9,700 got on their knees and stuck their face in the water. And as a military strategist, I'm thinking like, man, those 300 that were able to do this were still alert fighters. They could still look around and be alert. Those who got on their knees and stuck their face in the water, those weren't very alert fighters. And God said to send them home. And now with only 300 men left, God instructs Gideon that the time had come to go into battle. And Gideon had to be scared, right? But God knows our hearts, and God knows our fears. And including Gideon's fear that 300 of his men were going to face 135,000 man army. 300 were going to face 135,000 men. The same 135,000 that had ruled them for decades. The same ones that had him hiding down in that cave. And so God knows our fears. And so God told Gideon, if you're still afraid to do this, or you're afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant, and I want you to listen to what the Midianites are saying. And after that, you're going to be encouraged to attack the camp. So Gideon snuck down to the Midianite camp, and he overheard two Midianites talking. And as they're talking, one talks about a dream they had that God had given victory to a man named Gideon. And when Gideon heard that, man, that was a sign he needed. He was motivated. He was inspired. He knelt down. He started worshiping God. And then he went back to his 300 men, and he said to get up. The Lord has given the Midianites into our hands. Right? He was ready to go into battle. And under the cover of night, the men approached the camp, and Gideon led his 300 warriors to surround the camp and attack. And when they attacked, the Midianites actually panicked because it was in the middle of dark. They couldn't see who was attacking them. So in dark, they just started killing everyone they saw, which was themselves. They started killing themselves, and Gideon and them snuck in to kill the remainder, including the two kings that Gideon actually killed himself. Gideon's key to victory was not having enough men. Gideon's key to victory wasn't having a good strategy. The key to Gideon's victory was his obedience to this impossible mission that God called him to do, that God was more than capable of pulling off, right? The Bible teaches us that true victory comes from God's hands and not ours. Gideon faced his own self-doubt. When we did the Afghanistan operation, I faced my own self-doubt, and I'm sure each of you in here have had times in your life where you faced self-doubt. But the one thing that Gideon had in his control was a choice, right? I had a choice. Gideon had a choice. You have a choice. We could simply choose, as Gideon did, to say yes to God, to be obedient to the things that he's burdened our hearts to do. We won't know how it's going to turn out. I didn't know how Afghanistan was going to turn out. I had no idea how it's going to turn out. I mean, I remember Dennis and I Dennis had just got shot at by a Russian sniper, and we pulled ourselves. We went to the side, and I'm like, man, you got your wife and 4 kids at home. You still in? And he's like, I'm still in. Let's do this. Let's help. And we didn't know. I mean, my wife's driving me to the airport. My wife's like, why are you doing this? I'm like, what if it was us? What if it was my daughter? What if the Taliban was coming to make my daughter a sexual slave for the rest of her life, and it was my sons that'd be pushed into madrasas to become terrorists? We'd be praying that someone would come help us. But we didn't know the results. We didn't know we were going to be safe. I mean, Gideon didn't know the results. He didn't know that the victory was going to come. The truth is, there have been many followers of Christ that have been persecuted or even died doing exactly what God called them to do. That's the truth. But that's not the point. The point isn't our assurances. The point isn't our safety. The point isn't our personal victories or meeting goals that we want. The point isn't the return on investment. One of those guys in that video, Seaspray, we were being interviewed recently. I mentioned this, I think last time I spoke about a month ago. We were being interviewed, and they asked him that same question that had been asked a lot. Why are you doing this? We're like, because it's the right thing to do, right? And that's true. It's the right thing to do. But then they ask him another question, like, is it worth it? Right? Is it worth it to go there and put your life at risk? And he said, it doesn't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be worth it to do the right thing. We don't always have to have a return on investment to do the right thing. When we're obedient to God, when you're obedient to God, the assurances don't come with that. Don't let anybody fool you. The safety doesn't come with it. The personal victories don't come with it. The point is obedience. But in the big picture, that's where victory really comes. Could you imagine, if we all lived our lives this way in every area? I'm pretty convicted, putting this message together and giving this message to you, because I could say this, for Afghanistan and the way I run my ministry, but that's not the way I run every area of my life. Every area of my life, I don't have that level of obedience to God. I don't have that level of faith in God. There's areas that I try to control myself. But what if we trusted God and let God work in our lives in every single area? That's what it's about. It's about saying yes to him and letting him use us to change the world and then putting a spotlight on him for everyone to see. That's what it's about. If we could get that, if we could actually get that and apply it in our lives, what would our homes look like? What would our relationships look like, our community and our churches? What would this country look like if we could get that? And the truth is actually we can. We can. If we could simply, in every part of our life, disregard our fears, reject our past and our inadequacies, and lean forward into the things that God's burdening our heart to do. The Apostle Paul actually got this in a profound way, because if anybody wouldn't have got this, if anyone would have disqualified themselves, it would have been the Apostle Paul. I mean, look, when Paul was Saul, he persecuted Christians, he killed Christians, he separated them from his family. Like, if anyone would have disqualified themselves from doing the work that God was calling them to do, it would have been Paul. But Paul got this, and he said this. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible because it really relates to my life. He said this in Philippians 3, verses 13 through 14. He says, "Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but one thing I do is, forgetting what lies behind me and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus." Right? He's saying, I don't have it all figured out, but one thing I know is this, is that I will not let my past hold me back from the work that God has for me to do. Right? And I want to ask us, what's holding you back? What's holding us back? Let it go. Let it go and say yes to God. Say yes to the things God's calling you to do so that he could do through you only things that he could do. Can we pray? Lord, I thank you for not just creating us, Lord, creating us for a purpose. I thank you for calling us to do things that are beyond our scope, beyond our imagination, Lord. You call each of us for things that are beyond our capabilities so that you could show the world what can be done through those of us who have faith in you. And I thank you for the opportunity to do what we did in Afghanistan, Lord. I thank you for people like this church who supported us and got behind us, Lord. And I just pray for each person here that as they're burdened to do the things that you're calling them to do, Lord, they'll have the willingness to simply be obedient and start there and then trust you for the rest. I thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.